Welcome to Worth Quoting.
Aboard.
Welcome to Worth Quoting, a program sponsored by Florida Community College. This is part of our speaker series, and our speaker today and our guest is Dr. Joe Kett, who is the author of this book, The Dictionary of Cultural Literacy, and also the chairman of the Department of History at the University of Virginia. Welcome, Joe. We're glad to have you.
Thank you very much.
I know that this is only a part of what you do, but I'd like to talk about why you felt there was a need to write a dictionary of cultural literacy.
Well, Carol, the idea developed out of the feeling that the three of us, the really co-authors of the book, Don Hirsch, Jim Trefil, and I, had, that if you were to pick up the New York Times or Newsweek or Time magazine or the front page of the Wall Street Journal, you'd be surprised at the number of facts, a knowledge of which is assumed by the people writing that. They just assume you're going to know what the Golan Heights are, or what the INF Treaty is, or what an ICBM or IRBM is. And the more we investigated, the more we sensed that there was this kind of contextual knowledge that was necessary to follow along literate discourse, the discourse of the Times or Time magazine or Newsweek or the Atlantic magazines, newspapers like that. So we then embarked on a kind of brazen and cheeky task. We thought, well, why not just write all of this down? You know, let's try to make a list of what culturally literate people know and assume others know, because in fact, in all discourse, for example, between strangers, it proceeds only because people assume that a certain knowledge. I assume you know certain things, you assume I know certain things. That's why we can carry on a conversation. Let's try to get at this level of assumption, simply put it all down in print. And this began then as the list in Don Hirsch's book, Cultural Literacy. Now we've come out with the Cultural Literacy Dictionary. But that's in essence the notion of cultural literacy, the kind of literacy taken for granted in publications of the kind that I've described.
So do you see it as I'm reading an article and I don't understand a reference and I go to this thing, or do you see it as sitting down and going through it to sort of check your knowledge or brief yourself?
Either way, actually. I think it's a useful reference book, but it's somebody could pick up the section, for example, on the Bible and simply read through it. The print, in fact, is fairly large. It doesn't look like a dictionary, and one of the purposes of that would be to make this simply something you'd want to page through, to remind yourselves about a lot of things. There may have been words that you had heard dozens of times, like the modern Major General in Gilbert and Sullivan, who says, you know, when I know precisely what is meant by commissariat. Maybe you'd always heard commissariat and didn't know what it was. Well, okay, you can pick up the dictionary and find out the meaning of those words. The dictionary is not as inclusive as most dictionaries or encyclopedias, because in fact we're not trying to write down everything. We're trying to write down the kinds of terms that the culturally literate assume you know, but you may not know it.
Okay, what about the sections? You mentioned a section on the Bible. There are several sections in there. Of course, there's an index, so you can look things up by the word itself.
Yeah.
But what kind of sub-chapters do you have?
Well, the three broad subdivisions, and it doesn't go alphabetically from A to Z. The three broad subdivisions are the humanities, and Don Hirsch primarily was responsible for those. The social sciences, and I was responsible for those, and the natural sciences, and Jim Trefil, who's a physicist, was responsible for those. Now, for example, the social sciences, we have history, sociology, anthropology, psychology, business and economics, geography. The humanities, you'll find world literature, literature in English, conventions of written English, the Bible, of course, and then the usual divisions of the natural sciences. But you could simply pick up one of the divisions of the book and go through it if you were curious to find out, okay, let's see, what should I know in psychology? And many of the terms in psychology are terms that are, used by people all the time, but they don't necessarily understand a great deal. You know, id, ego, superego, a lot of psychobabble, you know, Oedipal complex. And my assumption is that students encounter these words and are intimidated. They say, gee, what's Oedipal? You know, well, okay, there it is, look it up.
Well, the definition that you use, are you taking them straight out of textbooks, or are you having to reinvent or redefine or reclarify these definitions? Did you have to do that too, as well as choose the
Well,
list?
that was part of the plan, because our assumption is that you don't have to know everything about, well, let's say the labors of Hercules. Now, I've told students, oh, okay, young man, you have the labors of Hercules confronting you before you're going to get a C in this course. That just means you've really got to work very hard to get a C. That's probably all you have to know about the labors of Hercules, that it means you're going to have to work very hard. I can name one of the labors of Hercules. He swept the Augean stables. That may be the only one. What you need, in other words, is a definition with key associations, so that when you're reading, if you come upon a word in a sentence, it won't stop you dead in your tracks. You can continue on to the next word. For example, Marx. Okay, now you run into this all the time, Marx, Marxism. What is that? What do you have to know about Marx? Well, that it's Karl Marx and not Groucho would be useful. Then there are some things you probably should know about Karl Marx. You should know that he was a 19th century German economist and philosopher, but to understand what you're reading, you don't have to know his dates. That's unimportant. You should understand that he wrote a book called Capital, which in German is Das Kapital, and that he and Engels wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto, and that one of the lines right in toward the end is, "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." Actually, that's what most people think the line is. The line is somewhat different than that. Okay, those are the associations of Marx. We would also say Marx is associated with class struggle. He believed class struggle was inevitable, particularly class struggle between the proletariat, that's defined in there, and the bourgeoisie. I don't think there's too much else in there on Marx. These are brief definitions stressing the principal associations of something.
Why do you need this book now? I mean, are people not getting this in high school? I mean, what level is this? When do you become culturally literate?
Our assumption is, or our belief was, that it would be valuable to have this information by the time you went to college. I have found as a college teacher that many of the students whom I have taught who have done poorly have done so because, not because they're stupid, but because they're ignorant of terms that I use and don't define. For example, I might use a word like left wing or right wing. Now, I'm assuming you know those terms. You and I can have a discussion. You may not know the origin of those terms in the French Revolution. It's not really so important to know the origin of those terms. But you know, when I say left wing, what I'm suggesting, if I say somebody's right wing, and if I said Pinochet, let's say, you'd think right wing. But if a student, let's say that word bounced off him like a rubber ball. He has no conception what you're talking about. You're just babbling, you know. And he said, "What, the wings of what? The wings of a dove, the wings of an eagle, the wings of a bird? What is this?" So terms like that, I think, are important for students to understand by the time they're in college, simply because they will often encounter professors who are not trying to make life difficult for the students, who just assume that you know those words and phrases.
Okay, so this is a good way to go back and look those things up if you're in the classroom. But you know, what about the person who's on the street that may or may not run into these kinds of things? I mean, is this really? Is your student audience is that your audience? The student?
No,
that's
I don't
going
think
to
it's
college,
exclusively. It's not exclusively the audience. For one thing, as you know, since you're the dean of a continuing education campus or division, there is an enormous interest in the part of the American public today in continuing education. A lot of people are going back to university. There are a lot of people who are in effect autodidacts, who are studying on their own, who could use a book like this as a handy reference. It's supposed to make literate reading easier for you. And it's not just, of course, in history. I use historical examples. Economics. I mean, a lot of people take what you said you studied management. Well, then you presumably read the Wall Street Journal. If you pick up the front page of the Wall Street Journal, I'm sure you could find 30 or 40 phrases, a knowledge of which is taken for granted right on the front page.
It's true. I just wondered about the need for this book at this point. I mean, is this a reaction to Trivial Pursuit? Is this a reaction to lowering test scores? Is this a reaction to you know, did students used to get this and they don't get it now, or is
Well, Don Hirsch, who inspired the project, believes that to be true, that they once got it and don't get it now. I've always been more skeptical about that proposition because, in fact, students didn't learn anything if they weren't at school, and 50 years ago, a lot of them never went near the schoolhouse. So we can't be sure that a higher proportion of Americans in 1900 were culturally literate than is true today. Personally, I doubt that they were. I think cultural literacy has probably been increasing. On the other hand, there have been certain strains in 20th century education that this book is working against. And one of those strains has been that to emphasize that education essentially is the teaching of skills rather than information. One of our more controversial assertions, I suppose, is that information really counts in education. We've been accused by critics of encouraging the return of rote memorization. Actually, to some extent, that's true. If you're going to learn facts, to a degree, you're going to have to memorize them. You know, it's like there are some language schools which tell you that you're going to learn the language the way the natives learn it. You know, painlessly, that says, oh, that must be painless, right? Somehow, even when I'm sleeping, I'll learn the language. And then you get into school, and they found out that they're handing out a list of vocabulary words and say, you know, learn these 40 words each night. That is, factual knowledge has to be learned by memorization. And we are arguing that students at certain levels should have certain facts. And if they don't, they're going to have difficulty entering into literate discourse. So that is a subversive argument. In that sense.
Where do you come? Do you have a stand on that yourself about teaching skills versus teaching information, or you think it's both?
Well, it has to be both, obviously. I would think that you really can't teach something called a skill of critical thinking that can be detached from one field to another field, that you could, like, any more than you can teach scientific method and simply say, well, if you've taken one physics course, that's as good as having taken a chemistry course or a biology course because you've learned something called the scientific method or the skill of critical thinking. You can't think critically, for example, and I hate to go back to history, but it's the only thing I know. You can't think critically about the causes. We couldn't have a critical discussion of the causes of the Civil War unless certain facts were in your head and in my head. There wouldn't have to be thousands of facts. You'd have to know what the Dred Scott decision was, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, John Brown's raid, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Those would have to trigger some sort of associations. So factual knowledge is indispensable to critical thinking. One
of the things that I've seen recently on television, I think it was a Barbara Walters special on TV where she was doing an interview and she said this percent of high school graduates don't know X and this percent of adults don't know X, and it might be the capital of a state, or it might be, in some cases it might be the date of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Some people don't know, but in any case, what do you is that a cultural illiterate that doesn't know those kinds of things?
That's borderline, I think. It depends on how the question is asked. Those questions sometimes catch people unawares. Sometimes the question is more difficult. I mean, you don't have to know. You say, all right, Pearl Harbor. I guess the word, the position of cultural literacy would be that December 7th has come to have certain connotations in American society. And Pearl Harbor has had some connotations that you should know. Probably you should know December 7th, 1941. I don't see why you have to know VE Day. You know, I don't know what VE Day is offhand. It must have been May 1st or 2nd or something, but I don't know. I could easily, you know. I'm not sure you have to know the exact date on which an atom bomb. I don't see why it was dropped on Hiroshima. It's just December. There are certain, every once in a while, a date like December 25th, you know, and December 7th picks up reverberations in the culture. When I was in high school, you know, every time the teacher sneaked a test on us, we'd scream, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor. You know, we were culturally literate in that sense. But let me just go back to one of the points. You know, I think there's been a little bit of, there have been some dubious tactics here. There was a test put out by National Geographic, you may have seen, which reveals startling facts about the ignorance of the American public about geography, much of which I was willing to believe. That test, however, was very hard and didn't involve exactly what we mean by cultural literacy. For example, what appeared in the newspapers was that only 1 out of 4 Americans could identify the Persian Gulf, or could find the Persian Gulf on a map. All right, I don't know if 1 out of 4 people in most universities could find the Persian Gulf on a map. It's very hard to find the Persian Gulf on the map, and the reason is that they excluded all place names from the map. You have no points of orientation in that National Geographic test. Now, there are a lot of small bodies of water, relatively small bodies of water in that part of, I mean, it could have been the Red Sea, which is just on the other side, or of the Arabian Peninsula, or the Black or Caspian Sea. That was a tough question, I thought. And I don't think that a culturally literate person has to be able to find the Persian Gulf on a blank map. I mean, what he has to know is something about the Iran-Iraq War, so that when he sees Persian Gulf, it triggers associations. Iran and Iraq, the flow of oil through the Middle East, so that he can be literate, meaning he can read. This is all about reading. It's not trivial pursuits. It's all about reading. It's how to have the education necessary to read literate discourse.
Well, this had to be a hard decision for you all to take a list, I mean, to even compose a list or to find a list and then go through it and decide who's on it, what's on it, and what difference it made. How did you do that?
Well, it was an interesting exercise.
Did you do this over coffee in the middle of the night?
Well, more or less. It does have, the whole list had, the original list had a quaintly homemade quality. I mean, it wasn't made up by some national committee on literacy. And we met each Friday at a Mexican restaurant in Charlottesville. Mexico got left off the list. That's one of the jokes that I tell people about. It must have had something to do with meeting at a Mexican restaurant. We didn't spend much time on geography. We used this criterion. All right, would a culturally literate person, and we meant people like ourselves, we assumed we were culturally literate.
You guys are PhDs at University of Virginia.
That's
You're
right,
not
but
typical.
would a culturally literate person, not would he know it, would he take it for granted?
Okay.
Okay, I mean, obviously we knew a lot more. We're just saying, you know, would a culturally literate person take a knowledge of this for granted? And actually, the way the psychodynamics of the group, as it worked out, is that if I proposed a name from history and Trefil didn't know it and Hirsch never heard of it, then it was out.
Oh,
And
this is a scientist and an English major.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. In other words, I was not there as the expert on history. And I'd say a name, and Hirsch would say, you know, like, well, nullification crisis, that's not on the list. And Hirsch would say, you don't have to know that. I forget what the nullification crisis. Well, it's true. That the type of history that tends to live in the memory of the culturally literate who are not historians is often a history that has associations with dramatic personalities or with myth. And something like the nullification crisis hasn't really lived on in the memory. So we excluded it, just as we excluded Matthew Arnold. We're not saying these are not important. We're just saying that a knowledge of this would be explained rather than taken for granted. Paul Revere, on the other hand, okay, that would be taken for granted. Anne Boleyn would be taken for granted. Now, why would you take a knowledge of Anne Boleyn for granted? Well, she's intrinsically interesting. I mean, how many, you know, she's the wife of the King of England, and he has her beheaded for adultery. That's intrinsically, and it's been dramatized again and again and again with the wives of Henry VIII. So to answer your question, it was a very bold and cheeky enterprise to compile a list of 5,000 items that the culturally literate would assume a knowledge of. The impulse behind this, however, I'd have to say was essentially pragmatic. I was describing this recently to a British scholar, and she said, you know, this is amazing. In Britain, they would never tell you the answers to this, you see. So this is very American. It's very pragmatic. You're simply writing it down and making it public information. In Britain, they just raise their eyebrows if you didn't know something.
Oh.
So
this is a way of democratizing
the language. Well, this is our sense. We're saying this is a way to democratize it. We're saying this is pragmatic. We're writing it down. Look, here it is. You know, here it is. This is what we know. You know, or at least that's not all we know, but it's the knowledge we have that enables the three of us to have lunch with each other and communicate about a variety of issues. Even though one of us was in history, one of us was a physicist, and another person did 18th century literature. Well,
did somebody ever champion something? If the two of you didn't know, the two odd men out didn't know something, was there anybody who said, well, you should know this? And
well, the one clear instance of that was Trefil in the science sections. And if you read the natural science sections, Trefil has a long justification in there. Essentially, the criterion I've just described to you was not used in the natural science sections. The natural science sections are prescriptive. I would not pretend that they are what the culturally literate know. I think that they
That's good news, because I looked through it.
No, but that's, if you read the introduction to it, Trefil says that this is in natural science is different. The problem, the assumption there was that the culturally literate knew so little science. All right, knew so little science that actually if you didn't become prescriptive. If you merely described what they knew, the section would be that short. You know, you'd have atom, you know, and kinetic energy and
Nuclear and a few
nuclear
things.
reaction or
Yeah.
something, yeah. So that the natural science section is quite different. I mean, that proceeds on a different principle. The social sciences and humanities, though, we've stuck to this idea for knowledge is assumed.
What'd you do on the Bible? I mean, did you have different religions that you could sort of bounce each other, you know?
They're pretty much the same principle. Are you familiar with this? Are you familiar with that? That was fairly easy, actually, because all of us were, for different reasons, familiar with the Bible, and all of us are struck by the extent to which biblical analogy still, I mean, it's still the book, it's still the basis. And I didn't find that particularly difficult. You know, would you include this or include that? Doctrines, certain doctrines of religions that are important to know. I mean, if Holy Communion has no associations for you, you'd have a hard time, well, for one thing, studying the history of the Reformation. You know, what is this Holy Communion that they're talking about? Those doctrines that were argued about, historically, the religious doctrines that were argued, let's say, between the Catholics and the Protestants, would be the very ones that cultural literacy would embrace, because they're the ones you'd encounter in your reading. I don't think that presented any particular difficulties. We then sent the list around to a lot of people, you know, and the historians all said, by the way, I mean, I was criticized by historians, oh, you have to have a lot more history on the list. And interestingly, I didn't respond to that. I said, no, I don't want too much history. There isn't that much history in there, because my assumption has been that the culturally literate don't know much history. They tend to remember only the Anne Boleyns, or the slogans, the 5440s or fight, or the semi-mythical heroes that Paul reveres, and that's all right. And those are the words they'll assume a knowledge of. You don't have to, I mean, the culturally literate can't name all the provisions of the 14th Amendment, but they've heard of due process, First Amendment freedoms, you know, right you know, against self-incrimination. Those phrases have worked their way into the grain.
Anything else is, again, would be defined in whatever it
That's
was
what we
presented.
think. We'd say that that's right. That if someone, the 14th Amendment, and someone said the third clause of the 14th Amendment, they tell you the third clause. They wouldn't assume you know that. But if they said under the due process clause or under the privileges and immunities clause, something like that, then they'll say, all right, now what's that in? And what was the 14th Amendment? Of course, they'll assume a knowledge of the 14th Amendment. I mean, someone said the 14th Amendment to what? How do we know it's the Constitution? You see what I mean by the assumption? We've been assuming right here between us.
That's right.
That when we said the 14th Amendment, we meant the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And that, again, like the Bill of Rights, okay, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. We just assume that.
And that's in here because it's assumed
Sure.
and you should know it.
It is, yeah. The 14th Amendment, sure. That's the amendment to what?
So what other kind of criticism was there? I mean, I can see that you wanted to have, or somebody wanted to have more history in here.
Well-
What other, I mean, now that you've done it and it's, I don't know how many pages long.
Yeah. I haven't counted, 600-700. It's
Yeah.
not too long. There are two broad types of criticisms have been made of the book, and of the whole idea, and I've divided them up into the pedagogical critics, and basically what they're saying is that it's wrong to have facts, that education should focus on skills rather than on facts, and of course we're saying the two are inseparable, and this is a dictionary of facts. I don't know of any dictionaries of skill, but we're certainly not saying that you shouldn't pursue skills. We're just saying this is what we think you should know. The other kind of criticism is really political, and it comes from people who say that we neglect the contributions of blacks or women, that this is really a sexist, racist, elitist enterprise. And the list omitted some blacks and women, two good examples, well, Harriet Tubman and Amelia Earhart. They were just stupid omissions, which have been remedied. I think that all the time, groups are trying to have their heroes worked into the national literate culture, okay? And that's a perfectly legitimate enterprise. We know a lot about Paul Revere, for example. Now, why do we know a lot? Why is Paul Revere on the list? Well, partly from a myth-making process. Longfellow wrote a poem about him and invented certain things about Paul Revere and made him a hero. Without Longfellow, I don't think Paul Revere would have been the national hero. Blacks have done recently much the same with a man named Crispus Attucks, who was a mulatto killed in the Boston Massacre a little before the American Revolution. And he's in all the textbooks now, or that I've seen. Crispus Attucks, sometimes he's called the first American killed in the Revolution. Well, that's not quite true because he was killed before the Revolution. We know next to nothing, by the way, about his motives. He might have just been out for a walk and got caught in the crossfire that day of the Boston Massacre. But the point is, blacks have been pushing him for elevation into the kind of national pantheon. He's on the list now. He's in the dictionary because we're saying, yeah, okay, you're in with that one. This has reached the point. Crispus Attucks is being taken for granted. Blacks, women, and other groups will always be thrusting their groups into the national literate culture, and that's fine with us. We're just saying that we should be aware that the culturally literate, be they black or women or white, Anglo-Saxon, male, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Zoroastrian, whatever, will continue to take certain names for granted in discourse. Let's just cooperate and try to figure out what it is and establish the perimeters. The aim is not elitist. The aim is to make this stuff accessible. It's not to ward people off. And one example I use, I mean, if you listen to speeches by Jesse Jackson, okay, let's take Jesse Jackson. You say this is somehow a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant list, although actually none of the people who drew up the list were Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Jesse Jackson, are you telling me that when he speaks in some culture other than the national literate culture? He refers to the Bible, doesn't he? Okay, it's in there. The New Deal, the war on poverty, a host of terms you could cull from Jesse Jackson's talks, which represent the terms of the national literate culture. That's the language he speaks. He makes allusions to the national literate culture. He doesn't speak in some foreign tongue.
And everybody can understand him, or should
and
be able to.
Well, people do understand him. So I think that that has been one of the types of criticisms.
I see. So we don't have but about 60 seconds to finish this program up, and I did want to mention the name of the book again, Dictionary of Cultural Literacy, which is maybe a companion to the other one that was written on cultural literacy?
Well, it's sort of son of Lassie, basically.
Son of Lassie.
Because we were not, when we did cultural literacy, to tell the truth, the first volume, we had no conception. And Hirsch wrote the volume, let me make that clear. Hirsch wrote the book, Cultural Literacy. We spent a lot of time talking about it together. We had no idea we were working on a bestseller, and that just blew us out of our chairs. Most publishers rejected the list. So this is just a follow-up, the answers. Anytime you have some great commercial success, of course, somebody's going to think of following it up. But also, I think this is very much in the spirit
of the
book.
Well, it's wonderful that a lot of people are interested in becoming more literate and continuing their education, at least in this way, if not in another setting like Florida Community College. We'd like to thank you very much, Joe, for being with us.
Thank you, Carol.
This is Carol Miner from Florida Community College thanking you for participating in this discussion on cultural literacy. Thanks again.